There once was a prince born in a storm of prayers, golden, sacred, and drenched in the blood of queens. England had carved a cradle for him out of bone and iron. They said he was the answer, the miracle, the son for whom kingdoms had bled. But gold, when left in silence, tarnishes. He was Henry's prize, the only one. The heir sealed by death itself, Jane Seymour's pale lips never kissed him. Her body was buried while his was being christened. And from that first breath, his soul was already exchanged for a crown. He would never be a child, only a vessel, a quiet outline of a man not yet formed. The court called him Edward. They bowed to his breath. But behind velvet curtains, they whispered of his fragility, his limp fingers, his hollow eyes, the way his voice cracked like glass in winter. His kingdom stood on eggshells, ruled by men pretending to serve while carving their own names into his throne. The boy watched, silent, a puppet draped in ermine, nodding on cue. He did not scream when his body betrayed him. He did not cry when his lungs began to drown in silence. He had been taught to die like a king with his mouth closed and his soul obedient. In the end, even Edward VI, the son Henry VIII ruined the world to obtain, was devoured not by enemies, but by silence. His death left no echo, no fire, no fury, just the soft, sour scent of something decaying in the air. And those who fed off him, those who moved his lips and signed their futures with his fingers, they vanished into smoke. This is not a tale of power. It is the sound of it collapsing, quietly, inside a golden boy who was never allowed to live. His bones were not buried beneath triumph, they were hidden beneath fear. And the crown that rested on his brow was too heavy for breath. He wore it anyway. He was born beneath a sky that held its breath. The bells rang not for peace, but for survival. A trembling England had waited for this child, as if he were a bridge over chaos. Edward, named not in honor, but in prophecy, arrived in a room still stained with his mother's blood. Jane Seymour, silent and lifeless, offered him to the world like a sacrificial lamb. The court wept and cheered in the same breath, not for her death, but for his birth. They dressed him in gold-threaded linen before he could open his eyes, whispering titles into his ears before he could speak. From the very first moment, he was not Edward the boy. He was the solution, the anchor, the myth. His breath became the currency of peace. But what peace grows in a kingdom where fathers kill wives for sons? What joy can bloom in the shadow of execution? The halls of Hampton Court smelled of fresh paint and old blood. Nurses passed through his chambers like ghosts, instructed not to touch, not to linger. His body, delicate and pale, was charted like a battlefield, every cough recorded, every flush of skin inspected like an omen. They feared that the child, so craved, would crack like thin porcelain. The physicians called it caution, the shadows called it curse. Even as an infant, he belonged to the crown more than to flesh. Henry VIII, swollen with aging triumph, looked upon his son not with love, but with hunger. Here was his proof, his legacy. The boy would grow into a lion, they said. But no one noticed how soft his bones were, how his breath sometimes stalled in sleep. The nurseries were lined with gold, but they were silent, hollow, designed not for play, but for preservation. Edward's tutors arrived before he could form memories, Latin, theology, the mechanics of war. His education was not for understanding, but for preparing a throne that would swallow him whole. He was never taught how to laugh, only how to rule. At 6 years old, he began to write in a hand too controlled for innocence. His letters were neat, his words shaped like masks. He was a child of mirrors, reflecting expectations with precision, concealing the faint cracks spreading behind his eyes. The lords bowed low, but their mouths were thick with plots. Even as they praised his learning, they drafted secret alliances in ink and wine. The boy did not understand yet, but he saw, and the seeing would undo him. His mind, sharp but tender, became a vessel for other men's ambitions. He was crowned at 9, a crown too heavy for his temples, a robe too long for his spine. The coronation smelled of incense and sweat. Trumpets blared like warnings. He stood alone beneath the vaulted ceiling of Westminster Abbey while men knelt and swore oaths they did not believe. He was a king without power, a puppet clothed in divinity. They taught him to smile while they gutted his authority. The protector. Somerset, his uncle, took the reins, wrapped in velvet lies. The realm obeyed Somerset while pretending to obey Edward. But even Somerset's loyalty was laced with personal hunger. Behind every prayer, there was a ledger. Behind every council meeting, a shadow. Edward watched as his name was used to pass laws, seize lands, and silence dissent. The Reformation, once fire and fury, became cold policy in the mouth of a boy who barely understood what it meant to banish saints and rewrite heaven. They made him the face of purity while they desecrated churches in his name. Stained glass shattered in his honor. Monasteries burned beneath his smile. He signed decrees with steady hands, never knowing that his own body was the first to be sacrificed. Illness clung to him like a second skin. First it was fever, then the coughing, then the wasting. He grew thinner each winter, his skin stretched over a weakening frame. But to the court, his pain was an inconvenience. They spoke of his strength of mind even as his body betrayed him. Physicians came and went, bringing leeches, mercury, and silence. Edward never screamed, even when the nights lengthened, even when blood traced the corners of his lips. He endured with regal stillness. He believed in duty more than breath, and so he coughed behind embroidered curtains, wrote prayers in trembling script, and pretended to be a king. No child should rot in full view of angels, but Edward did. His bed became a throne of decay, each sheet a shroud. No one dared speak of death, not aloud. But death filled the corners of the room in the smell of damp cloth, in the fading strength of his voice, in the way servants began to lower their eyes. He still performed his role. He still greeted ambassadors, still took communion, still wrote to his sisters with courtesy and care. But the crown had eaten too much, and Edward had so little left. His hair thinned, his teeth loosened, his chest caved. Yet they dressed him each morning as if nothing was wrong. Rituals continued, the court hummed, and the boy dwindled behind the illusion. He became a ghost wrapped in royal silk, a living martyr to his father's obsession with legacy. Henry VIII had built a kingdom upon broken marriages and broken oaths, and Edward was its final offering. The boy was too loyal to flee, too gentle to resist, and too sacred to be saved. In the rare moments of solitude, he stared into the fire as if searching for a face, his mother's perhaps, or God's. But the flames gave him nothing, only warmth that didn't reach his bones. And when he prayed, it was not for healing, but for permission to disappear with dignity. He wrote a final document, a devise for the succession, naming Lady Jane Grey as his heir. It was not a decision born of political wisdom. It was the last gasp of control from a boy who had never been allowed to choose anything. Not his fate, not his breath, not even the weight of his silence. As the end crept closer, the walls seemed to press in. His attendants spoke in murmurs, and the halls of Greenwich Palace smelled of damp rot and burning herbs. Time stopped following the sun and followed his pulse instead. When he drifted in and out of sleep, he dreamed not of battles or crowns, but of gardens, quiet places without gold, without titles, places where a boy could breathe. But the kingdom would not let him go gently. The court demanded appearances. Bishops arrived to speak of salvation. Noblemen hovered, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Edward, always obedient, received them with a nod. He was still the king, even if he could no longer walk without help. Still the king, even when the fever burned his vision into fog. Still the king, even when the pus gathered in his lungs and made every breath sound like drowning. His death was not announced. It was denied, delayed, disguised. For days after his final breath, they kept the windows closed, the curtains drawn, the whispers locked behind stone walls. It was July 1553. The air was thick with heat and the stench of lies, and Edward VI, the golden heir, lay rotting in royal silence, denied even the decency of a nation's mourning. There were no cries of the people, no black banners across the land, only a void where a voice should have been. The boy who had once been the promise of peace became a secret no one wanted to remember. His body was buried in Westminster Abbey with perfunctory prayers, his name already fading from the mouths of courtiers who now pledged allegiance elsewhere. His crown passed to a girl who lasted 9 days. His legacy became a footnote, his memory a shadow. And yet, beneath all the layers of betrayal, ritual, and silence somewhere in the folds of velvet and dust, the boy still lingers. Not as a king, but as a question no one dares ask: what becomes of a soul that was never allowed to live before it died? They circled him like priests around an altar, but it was not God they worshipped. It was access. Power leaked through Edward's name like blood from a wound, and the men nearest to him cupped their hands to catch it, not to heal. The throne had no soul, only teeth, and each lord who knelt before the boy did so with knives in their sleeves. He was never surrounded by protectors, only butchers waiting for the moment his flesh could be carved into titles. Thomas Seymour, the Lord High Admiral, uncle by blood, brother to the Protector Somerset, began to circle with the scent of ambition. He watched Edward's youth as weakness, saw the gap between crown and maturity as an opening for conquest. In the dead of night, he visited the boy king's chambers, whispering promises of true kingship, of freedom from the suffocating grip of the council. His boots echoed in those silent halls like a hunter treading softly through a chapel. But Edward, even in his innocence, sensed the tremble in Seymour's hands. Not devotion, desperation. And yet, how could he speak against an uncle? He had no sword but silence. The conspiracy thickened in the folds of velvet and parchment. Seymour began stockpiling allies in court, stirring rumors that Somerset was leading the boy astray, keeping him weak, controlled, malnourished in power. The accusations grew louder with each month that Edward's ribs became more visible, each breath more fragile. In secret, Seymour plotted to marry Princess Elizabeth, Edward's sister, to seal a dynasty under his control. But Elizabeth, sharper than her years, recoiled at the ambition masked as affection. When she rejected him, he grew erratic. He began breaking into the king's chambers at night, forcing entry under the guise of concern, always alone, always armed. When he was finally arrested, they found loaded pistols beneath his cloak protection. He claimed, but even Edward, coughing behind the tapestries, understood what kind of protection required bullets before words. Seymour's execution was not announced with sorrow, only relief. Another shadow removed, another wolf unmasked. But the wolves never truly left. They changed shape. Somerset's fall came next, and it was colder, more precise. His enemies, once his allies, dragged him through trials masked as justice. They spoke of mismanagement, of arrogance, of failing the young king, but beneath their words was the truth: Somerset had lost favor. And in court, favor was the only currency that spared the gallows. Edward, taught never to question, signed the warrant that sealed his uncle's death. His hand did not tremble. The ink dried quickly. And so the boy became the butcher by decree. At barely 12 years old, he had consigned both uncles to the axe, not through will but through duty, a cold obedience sown into his veins by a father who had wielded execution like a rosary. With Somerset dead, John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, emerged not as a savior but as a surgeon. He did not pretend affection. He moved with precision, with calculation, with the grace of a man who never wasted a lie. Where Somerset ruled with ego, Dudley ruled with silence. He did not speak unless he was certain the heir would not betray him. Under Dudley's eye, Edward was groomed not as a boy king, but as a doctrinal weapon. He was fed Reformed sermons, anti-Catholic doctrine, and Protestant fervor that burned hotter than his fevers. The boy's mind, brilliant yet unguarded, was shaped into a theological blade. He began to speak with unnatural certainty, condemning masses as idolatry, dismissing his sister Mary as a heretic, and calling the Pope the beast of revelation. But these were not the words of a child. These were the scripts given to him, whispered into his lungs like incense, repeated until they became indistinguishable from breath. Edward had become the perfect mask, pale, obedient, articulate, and Dudley wore him like armor. But the closer Edward drifted toward zealotry, the more his body decayed. The coughing deepened. Blood darkened the linens. Courtiers began stepping around him as if he were already dead. But Dudley did not see a boy. He saw a bridge, and bridges are walked on. When Edward's body began to curl inward, when his eyes grew glazed and his words slowed, Dudley moved faster. The line of succession had to be rewritten. Mary, devout Catholic and Henry's eldest daughter, posed a threat not just to Dudley's power, but to the entire edifice of Protestant reform. Elizabeth, politically volatile and quiet in her allegiances, was too unpredictable. Dudley needed a queen who would obey. Lady Jane Grey Noble, Protestant and married to his own son, was chosen like a pawn selected for sacrifice. Edward, barely breathing, was summoned to approve the devise for the succession. He signed it with fingers that shook, but not from doubt, from illness. Those in the room said he believed it was his duty, that he truly feared Mary's return would undo all reform. But what choice does a dying boy have when the entire world is speaking through his mouth? The document was signed. The treason was sealed. Dudley's power seemed absolute, but rot does not respect ambition. And Edward's body, patient and quiet, gave way before Dudley could fortify the throne. In the last weeks, the king's chambers grew darker. Curtains remained drawn even in daylight. The air thickened with oils, herbs, and unspoken terror. Food was untouched. Visitors were sparse. The only sound was coughing and silence between the coughs. Dudley watched with increasing urgency, pushing scribes to prepare documents, pushing Jane to ready herself. But Edward's death, long denied, came like a blade beneath velvet, sharp, unseen, final. Dudley concealed it for days, trying to maneuver the final pieces. But corpses are difficult to hide. The scent began to betray him. Word spread like smoke. And with Edward's final breath, the mask cracked. The court turned. Mary gathered her allies. Elizabeth stepped into the shadows with caution. Jane was placed on the throne for 9 days, a throne already soaked in Edward's sweat and silence. And Dudley, the man who had crafted a kingdom through manipulation, was left exposed beneath the sun he thought he could command. He was executed with the same efficiency he had once admired in others. But Edward was not there to witness it. He had already become memory, or rather, absence. There were no uprisings in his name, no rebellions for the boy king. His death had come not with screams, but with quiet. And the conspiracies that had used his body, voice, and crown vanished into new allegiances. He was not betrayed once. He was betrayed endlessly, by all sides, in every breath. His power was never his own. It was borrowed, bled, and buried. And in the end, Even his death was a strategy. Even his corpse was a delay. The silence around his body was not mourning. It was calculation. The golden heir, meant to unite a nation, was devoured not by war or heresy, but by the mouths of men who called themselves his guardians. He left behind no sonnets, no airs, no legends, only the faint memory of a boy who coughed too often and bowed too easily. In tapestries, his image remains rosy-cheeked, painted in triumph. But the truth is elsewhere in the locked rooms, the burned letters, the halls that remembered the sound of him breathing in pain. He was used until his lungs collapsed, and even then, they asked him to sign one more decree. It began with the quiet unraveling of flesh, slow, unceremonious, cruel in its precision. Edward's final days did not erupt like a tragedy. They withered like fruit left too long in an untouched orchard, softening under the weight of time, curling inward beneath layers of perfumed cloth and ceremonial expectation. No cry was permitted in the corridors. No honest breath. Each step near his chamber was rehearsed, as if the wrong rhythm might hasten his departure. The boy who had been crowned in golden flame now lay in a bed that smelled of damp earth and herbs, buried long before his body would be. His skin turned a waxen hue, pulled taut over sharp cheekbones, lips chapped, nails dulled like forgotten metal. Yet still, each morning, servants arrived with robes. Still, the court waited for his signature, his nod, his fragile blessing. His body betrayed him in degrees. First his appetite vanished, then his voice thinned to a whisper. The flesh around his collarbones grew hollow, and his spine began to press visibly against skin. The coughing came in waves, wet and labored, often followed by long stretches of breathless silence. At night, he trembled not from fever, but from the cold that crept through the bedchamber despite roaring fires. The windows remained shuttered. Light was considered an enemy now too honest, too revealing. The shadows were safer. They cloaked what the kingdom refused to name. Edward no longer wrote. His last attempts at correspondence were ghost-like half-formed thoughts in a slanted, unsteady hand. He stared long at the ceiling, sometimes mouthing verses from the Psalms, sometimes just listening for something that wasn't there. His once bright gaze faded to a sheen of constant exhaustion. In the moments he spoke, it was not as a monarch, but as a child, asking for water, for quiet, for the pain to be still. Those who came near him described the smell, first a cloying mixture of rot and lavender, of blood and sacred oil. No amount of perfume could mask the truth he was decomposing in life. Beneath the layers of damask and velvet, his body had begun its slow farewell, but no one dared hasten it. Dudley's men whispered outside the door, speaking in code, revising documents, forging futures in the name of a boy who could no longer lift his head. Time did not move forward, it moved inward. Every hour was an echo of the last. The physicians, desperate to perform usefulness, drained him with leeches, burned herbs to cleanse the air, and pressed blistering poultices to his chest, all while avoiding his eyes. They could not meet the look of a boy who knew he was dying. He had known it longer than they had, perhaps longer than any of them could accept. In one moment of lucidity, he asked if Jane had been told. His voice cracked on her name, not out of romance, but obligation. He knew the weight he had passed to her, knew the blade he had handed her, smiling weakly, pretending it was a crown. There was no comfort for that knowledge, no sanctuary, not even in prayer. The chaplains read scripture aloud while Edward drifted in and out, but the verses did not reach him. He was already past the threshold, not in spirit, perhaps, but in substance. His bones ached from within. His mouth dried into a line that could no longer hold command. His dreams, if they could still be called that, were vivid in their simplicity. Trees, wind, a mother's voice he never truly heard, her hand brushing his cheek, There was no throne in those dreams, no fathers, no knives. The final collapse came without drama. One evening, his breath shortened, clutched at the air like a man drowning in a pond of still water. His lips turned violet, the fire hissed low, and just before midnight, his chest rose once, strained, then fell like a broken wing. Silence followed, not the kind of silence that brings peace, but the kind that chokes. They did not announce his death immediately. The body was left in place, the sheets drawn up to the neck, the windows unopened, the doors locked. Edward's corpse began to cool beside the golden crest stitched above his head. Dudley ordered the news to be held. The court could not know. Not yet. Jane had to be crowned. The plan had to proceed. And so Edward, once England's light, once the golden hope of a blood-soaked dynasty, was left to fester in the dark. His servants were sworn to secrecy. His nurse wept in silence, hands clenched behind her back. The sound of death was absorbed by stone, and in those days of false continuity, the boy king became an unperson. His body was prepared with haste, buried in layers of royal regalia, painted with powder to conceal the signs of disease. Even in death, he was not permitted to appear weak. His casket was sealed before the rumors escaped, before the people could see the cost of what they had waited for. A procession was held formal, brief, bloodless. Westminster Abbey swallowed him without fanfare. The bell tolled, not in mourning but in protocol. There were no street tears, no rebellion, only adjustments, new loyalties, new oaths. His sister, Mary, incandescent with resolve, rose from the edges of the realm with banners, claiming what should have been hers. Jane, his pale successor, was forced onto the throne like a doll in a cruel game. And the moment Edward's ghost passed through the veil, the kingdom turned. Jane's reign collapsed in 9 days, as if cursed by the boy's dying breath. Mary seized the crown. Dudley was broken on the scaffold. The devise for the succession was torn apart, but none of them spoke of Edward. His name became fragile, like glass that shatters at mention. The boy had not ruled, he had been used. And what is used is rarely remembered. In portraits, he remains unblemished, frozen in adolescent serenity, fingers wrapped around a scepter he never wielded. But the truth breathes elsewhere, in the dust that lingers beneath palace floors, in the silks that once held his emaciated frame, in the forgotten hymns sung to no one. His legacy is not of triumph or tyranny, but of absence, a life swallowed by prophecy, a voice diluted by fear. He had been bred to save the dynasty, but his death marked the beginning of its end. Henry's line would twist into bloodshed and fire. And yet, in the center of that storm, Edward's ghost remained still, not vengeful, not mourned, just still. A boy who died before ever truly living, whose body was embalmed more for politics than love. The state had no sons left, only statues, only silence. And somewhere beneath the abbey, the bones of the golden heir sleep not in peace, but in the quiet suffocation of forgotten promise. They buried him beneath stone and gold, but nothing could quiet the rot. Not of his body that had already faded into stiffness and stillness, but of the silence that surrounded his name. Edward VI, they still call him, king, sovereign, supreme head of the Church of England. But titles do not weep, statues do not remember, and stone cannot hold the breath of a child who never truly breathed for himself. The court moved on. The blood of queens would flow again. Mary would burn heretics in the name of the God her brother once redefined. Elizabeth would rise like frost after fire. The dynasty would stretch and contort until even the memory of that pale boy with trembling hands was reduced to a date, a reign, a footnote. His portrait still hangs in palaces. Eyes too large, robes too clean a lie etched in oil and canvas. But the truth remains buried with him that the golden heir was never meant to live, only to prove that his father had won. That the throne could command life, that the crown could resurrect the past. But nothing grew from his reign. Only ash, only echoes. And in that final silence, beneath the abbey where prayers ring without meaning, the question still lingers like a draught through ancient corridors. What does it cost a boy to be born a king? The answer is not written in scripture. It is not sung in anthem. It lies unspoken beneath the stones, curled around the forgotten bones of a child who wore a crown too early and died too late.